The conflict, known as the Paraguayan War, was one of the largest and most devastating wars ever fought in the history of South America. It transformed entire nations, destroyed economies, reshaped political systems, and caused suffering on a scale that shocked even those who lived through the violence. Yet despite its enormous consequences, the war is often far less remembered outside the region than many European conflicts of the same century. For the people of Paraguay, Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay, however, it became a defining historical tragedy whose effects lasted for generations. The war began in the middle of the 19th century, a period when South America was still struggling to define itself after independence from European colonial empires. The old Spanish and Portuguese colonial systems had collapsed, but stable political order had not fully replaced them. Borders remained disputed, governments changed frequently, and many nations were divided internally between competing political groups, regional interests, and military leaders. Among these countries stood Paraguay, a landlocked nation located deep within the interior of the continent. Paraguay was isolated geographically, surrounded by larger neighbors, and dependent on river systems for trade and communication with the outside world. This isolation shaped much of the country's political culture and economic development. For decades after independence, Paraguay followed a relatively unusual path compared to many other South American states. Under strong, centralized leadership, the country attempted to reduce foreign influence and develop a degree of economic independence. Its governments invested in infrastructure, local industry, and military organization while limiting the control of foreign businesses and political interests. This approach created a state that was more isolated but also more internally organized than many of its neighbors. By the time Francisco Solano Lopez came to power, Paraguay possessed a disciplined army, centralized authority, and a leadership that believed the country could defend its sovereignty against external pressure. Lopez himself was ambitious, intelligent, and deeply influenced by European military culture. He admired strong states, standing armies, and centralized leadership. During travels abroad, he observed European politics and warfare closely, especially developments in France under Napoleon III. Lopez returned to Paraguay convinced that military strength and national unity were essential for survival in South America's unstable political environment. He expanded the Paraguayan army, strengthened fortifications, and increased state control over national affairs. To supporters, he appeared as a determined defender of Paraguayan independence. To critics, he appeared increasingly authoritarian and dangerously ambitious. The broader political situation in the region was highly unstable. Uruguay, one of the smaller states between Brazil and Argentina, was trapped in constant internal conflict between rival political factions known as the Blancos and the Colorados. These struggles frequently attracted intervention from neighboring powers, especially Brazil and Argentina, each seeking influence over Uruguayan politics. Brazil, at the time an empire under Emperor Pedro II, was the largest and most powerful country in South America. It possessed vast territory, economic resources, and growing military capacity. Brazilian leaders viewed stability in Uruguay as important for regional security and trade. When political violence in Uruguay intensified, Brazil increasingly involved itself in support of factions favorable to Brazilian interests. Argentina was also emerging from decades of internal division and civil conflict. Under President Bartolomé Mitre, the Argentine government sought greater national unity and stronger control over regional provinces. Argentina's leaders watched developments in Uruguay and Paraguay carefully, aware that instability along the river systems could affect trade, borders, and political influence throughout the region. Lopez viewed these events with growing alarm. He believed Brazilian intervention in Uruguay threatened the balance of power in the region and could eventually isolate Paraguay politically and economically. Paraguay's survival depended heavily on access to river routes through neighboring countries. If Brazil and Argentina gained too much influence over surrounding states, Lopez feared Paraguay could become trapped and vulnerable. At the same time, Lopez increasingly saw himself as a major regional leader capable of shaping South American affairs. His confidence grew alongside the strength of the Paraguayan military. Paraguay's army, though much smaller than Brazil's population overall, was highly organized by regional standards and benefited from centralized preparation. Lopez believed speed, discipline, and determination could compensate for Paraguay's smaller size. The immediate crisis emerged when Brazil intervened militarily in Uruguay during 1864. Lopez interpreted this action not simply as interference in Uruguayan politics, but as a threat to the regional balance itself. He warned Brazil against military action, but the warning was ignored. At this point, the situation escalated rapidly. Lopez responded by seizing a Brazilian ship and later invading the Brazilian province of Mato Grosso. This marked the beginning of open conflict. The attack shocked neighboring governments and transformed regional tension into full-scale war. Paraguay had chosen confrontation against a far larger opponent, believing that decisive action might prevent encirclement and preserve strategic balance. Yet the situation became even more dangerous when Lopez sought permission to move Paraguayan troops through Argentine territory in order to attack southern Brazil more effectively. Argentina refused. Lopez viewed the refusal as hostile cooperation with Brazil and responded by declaring war on Argentina as well. This decision dramatically widened the conflict. Brazil, Argentina, and eventually the new government of Uruguay formed the Triple Alliance against Paraguay. Together, these states possessed vastly greater populations, resources, and economic strength. What had begun as a regional dispute now became a massive war involving nearly the entire southern portion of the continent. At first, many in Paraguay believed victory was possible. The Paraguayan army moved quickly, launching offensives into neighboring territories with confidence and discipline. Early campaigns achieved some initial success and demonstrated the effectiveness of Paraguay's military organization. Lopez hoped rapid victories might force favorable negotiations before the larger powers could fully mobilize. But beneath these early successes lay dangerous realities. Paraguay's population was limited compared to its enemies. Its economy depended heavily on sustained organization and centralized control. Long war against multiple larger nations would place enormous strain on manpower, supplies, and transportation. Once the initial momentum slowed, maintaining the conflict would become increasingly difficult. The governments of Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay also understood the stakes involved. None of them wanted a militarized Paraguay dominating regional politics through force. The Triple Alliance committed itself to defeating Lopez completely, though differences in strategy and political priorities existed among the allies from the beginning. As armies mobilized across rivers, forests, and frontier regions, South America moved toward one of the bloodiest conflicts in its history. The war would become longer, harsher, and far more destructive than anyone initially imagined. Entire armies would disappear in disease-filled swamps. Cities would collapse under siege. Economies would be ruined, and Paraguay itself would face near total devastation. What began as a regional political crisis was becoming a catastrophe that would reshape the continent forever. As the war expanded across the river systems and frontier territories of South America, the early confidence that existed in Paraguay slowly collided with the enormous reality of the conflict it had begun. Francisco Solano Lopez believed speed and determination could overcome the advantages held by Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay. In the opening stages, Paraguayan forces moved aggressively, launching invasions into neighboring territory before the Triple Alliance could fully organize its response. These offensives created initial momentum and briefly gave the impression that Paraguay might achieve quick victories through surprise and discipline. Paraguayan troops entered the Brazilian province of Mato Grosso and pushed into Argentine territory with determination. The army was highly centralized, carefully organized, and loyal to Lopez. Compared to many South American forces of the era, Paraguayan soldiers were disciplined and accustomed to strict command. The government had invested heavily in military preparation before the war, and this preparation became visible during the first campaigns. Yet the geography of the conflict quickly revealed itself as one of the greatest challenges facing all sides. Rivers dominated transportation and communication throughout the region. Dense forests, marshlands, tropical heat, insects, disease, and vast distances turned military movement into an exhausting struggle. Armies often suffered more from illness, hunger, and exposure than from direct combat. The Triple Alliance, despite its enormous combined strength, also faced difficulties at the beginning. Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay did not always share identical political goals. Coordination between allied armies required negotiation, planning, and compromise. Supply systems had to be created across difficult terrain, and river control became essential for moving troops and equipment. Brazil possessed the largest resources among the Allies, but mobilizing those resources took time. The Brazilian Empire relied on a combination of professional soldiers, regional forces, and volunteers. At the start of the war, many Brazilian leaders underestimated the scale of the conflict and believed Paraguay could be defeated relatively quickly. That assumption would soon disappear. Argentina, under President Bartolomé Mitre, also faced internal complications. Some Argentine provinces were hesitant about committing fully to the war, and political divisions within the country affected military organization. Nevertheless, Argentina recognized that Paraguayan expansion threatened regional stability and joined the alliance with determination. The naval dimension of the war became critically important almost immediately because rivers served as the main transportation routes. Whoever controlled them gained enormous strategic advantage. Brazil's navy, far larger and more powerful than Paraguay's, gradually became one of the decisive factors in the entire conflict. One of the earliest major turning points came with the Battle of Riachuelo in 1865. This naval engagement proved disastrous for Paraguay. Brazilian naval forces defeated the Paraguayan fleet and secured control over key river routes. The consequences were enormous. Paraguay's ability to move troops, maintain supply lines, and continue offensive operations was severely weakened. After Riachuelo, the strategic balance of the war began to shift. Paraguay had hoped to win quickly before the Allied powers fully mobilized. Instead, the war was becoming prolonged, and prolonged war favored the larger economies and populations of the Triple Alliance. At the same time, Lopez refused to abandon his determination. He believed Paraguay could survive through resistance, strong defensive positions, and national unity. The Paraguayan government intensified mobilization, drawing more men into military service and placing increasing pressure on society to sustain the war effort. As Paraguayan offensives stalled, the Allies prepared for invasion into Paraguayan territory itself. This phase of the war became especially brutal. Paraguay's defenses relied heavily on fortified positions near rivers and swamps, where geography could slow enemy advances. Fortresses, trenches, artillery positions, and natural obstacles turned the countryside into a deadly battlefield. Disease spread constantly among both armies. Cholera, malaria, dysentery, and other illnesses devastated soldiers living in crowded camps under terrible conditions. Medical knowledge remained limited, sanitation was poor, and supply shortages weakened resistance to infection. Thousands died without ever seeing battle. The scale of suffering grew rapidly. Entire units disappeared from sickness and exhaustion. Soldiers marched through mud and flooded terrain, carrying heavy equipment under extreme heat. Food shortages affected both armies and civilians, while transportation delays created chaos across supply networks. The Battle of Tuyuti in 1866 became one of the largest and bloodiest battles in South American history. Lopez attempted a massive attack against Allied positions, hoping to break the momentum of the Triple Alliance before it became unstoppable. Paraguayan forces charged with enormous courage and determination, but the attack ended in catastrophic losses. Tuyuti demonstrated both the bravery of Paraguayan soldiers and the increasingly desperate nature of Lopez's strategy. Paraguay could not easily replace the enormous casualties suffered in such battles, while the Allies, especially Brazil, still possessed larger reserves of manpower and material. Despite these setbacks, Paraguayan resistance remained fierce. Lopez believed surrender would mean national destruction and humiliation. He encouraged the population to continue fighting regardless of cost. Patriotism, fear, loyalty, and government control combined to keep Paraguayan society mobilized even as conditions worsened. The Allied armies also paid a terrible price. Campaigns moved slowly through fortified regions, and every advance required enormous effort. Swamps and rivers made large operations difficult, while Paraguayan defenses inflicted heavy casualties. Victory was possible for the Allies, but it was proving far more expensive than expected. Political tensions appeared within the Triple Alliance as well. Questions emerged about leadership, war aims, and the growing financial burden of the conflict. Brazil increasingly carried much of the military responsibility, especially after Argentina faced internal unrest and logistical difficulties. Meanwhile, inside Paraguay, the war transformed daily life completely. Farms were abandoned as men joined the army. Women took on much of the agricultural labor necessary to keep the country functioning. Resources became scarce, and the government tightened control over society in order to sustain resistance. Lopez himself became increasingly suspicious and authoritarian as the situation deteriorated. Fear of betrayal spread within the leadership. Officials, officers, and even members of elite families faced accusations of disloyalty. The atmosphere inside Paraguay grew tense and fearful as military defeats mounted. Yet despite everything, Paraguay did not collapse. The country continued fighting with extraordinary determination, even as casualties rose and economic conditions worsened. The war was becoming not only a military struggle, but a national catastrophe unfolding in slow motion. By this stage of the conflict, it was clear that the Paraguayan War would not end quickly. The initial offensives had failed to force negotiation, and the Triple Alliance was now pushing steadily toward the Paraguayan heartland. What remained uncertain was how far Lopez and his country would go in resisting defeat. The answer would shape one of the darkest chapters in South American history. As the war dragged deeper into its later years, the conflict transformed from a regional power struggle into a catastrophe that consumed nearly every part of Paraguayan society. The early campaigns and failed offensives had already weakened the country severely, but now the full weight of the Triple Alliance began pressing directly against Paraguay itself. Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay possessed larger populations, larger economies, and greater access to weapons, ships, and supplies. Paraguay, isolated and increasingly exhausted, was forced into a desperate struggle for survival. The Allied armies slowly advanced through southern Paraguay, but progress remained painfully slow. Geography continued to favor defenders. Rivers, marshes, dense vegetation, and fortified positions made every movement dangerous and exhausting. Paraguayan forces used the terrain carefully, building trenches, defensive earthworks, artillery batteries, and strongholds designed to delay the enemy for as long as possible. One of the most heavily defended areas was the fortress complex around Humeda, positioned along the Paraguay River. Humeda became the center of Paraguayan defense strategy. Its fortifications controlled river access toward the interior of the country and created a major obstacle for Allied forces attempting deeper invasion. Massive chains stretched across parts of the river. Artillery batteries lined defensive positions, and surrounding swamps made direct assault extremely difficult. For a long time, Humeda appeared almost impossible to break. Allied commanders understood that without neutralizing the fortress, advancing further into Paraguay would remain dangerous. As a result, campaigns around the area turned into prolonged siege warfare marked by disease, hunger, bombardment, and constant exhaustion. Conditions for soldiers on both sides became horrific. Camps flooded during heavy rains. insects spread illness constantly, and poor sanitation turned disease into one of the deadliest weapons of the war. Cholera outbreaks devastated thousands of troops. Men weakened by malnutrition and exhaustion often died before reaching battlefields. Hospitals overflowed with wounded and sick soldiers suffering under primitive medical conditions. Brazil increasingly carried the burden of the war effort. The Brazilian Empire mobilized enormous resources to sustain campaigns far from its coastal population centers. Thousands of soldiers were transported through difficult river systems into the interior, while the government spent massive amounts of money to maintain armies, ships, and supply lines. The conflict placed huge pressure on the Brazilian economy and political system. Despite these sacrifices, progress remained slow and frustrating. Paraguayan defenders fought with fierce determination, refusing to surrender even under hopeless conditions. Francisco Solano Lopez continued urging resistance at all costs, presenting the war as a struggle for national survival against foreign invasion. Inside Paraguay, society itself was beginning to collapse under the pressure. Agricultural production declined sharply as much of the male population served in the military or had already died. Food shortages became severe. Women, children, and elderly civilians worked desperately to maintain farms, transport supplies, and support the war effort however possible. Lopez responded to worsening conditions by tightening control over the country even further. Suspicion spread throughout the leadership. Military failures increased fear of conspiracy and betrayal. Officials, officers, clergy members, and even Lopez's former allies were accused of treason. Some were imprisoned or executed during purges driven by paranoia and desperation. As the Allied armies closed in, the siege of Humeda became one of the central struggles of the war. Brazilian naval forces gradually forced passage through heavily defended river positions despite artillery fire and dangerous obstacles. This achievement weakened Paraguay's defensive system significantly and threatened communication with the interior. The eventual fall of Humeda in 1868 marked a devastating blow to Paraguay. The fortress had symbolized resistance and national defense. Its loss opened the path toward deeper invasion and demonstrated that even Paraguay's strongest defensive positions could no longer hold indefinitely against Allied pressure. Yet even after such defeats, Lopez refused negotiation or surrender. He withdrew further into the interior and continued organizing resistance. Paraguayan soldiers, many of them starving and exhausted, continued fighting under increasingly hopeless circumstances. Loyalty, fear, patriotism, and survival merged together in a conflict that had become almost unimaginable in its scale of suffering. The Allied advance toward Asunción, the Paraguayan capital, intensified. Towns and villages along the route suffered destruction as armies moved through them. Civilians fled from advancing forces or struggled to survive amid collapsing infrastructure and shortages of food and medicine. In early 1869, Allied forces occupied Asunción. The capture of the capital would normally have signaled the effective end of a war, but in Paraguay the conflict continued. Lopez escaped northward and attempted to continue resistance from remote regions of the country. The war had now entered an even darker phase, where organized national defense blended into desperate survival. By this point, Paraguay had suffered losses on a catastrophic scale. Large portions of the population had died from battle, disease, starvation, and displacement. The exact numbers remain debated by historians, but there is no doubt that the destruction was immense. Entire communities disappeared, and the demographic structure of the country was permanently altered. The human cost became especially severe among Paraguayan men of military age. As casualties mounted, younger and younger boys were drawn into military service. Elderly men and children appeared in defensive formations as the government attempted to sustain resistance despite near total exhaustion. One of the most tragic episodes came during battles involving child soldiers, particularly near the end of the war. Young boys, many barely old enough to understand the conflict, were sent into combat as Paraguay's remaining manpower collapsed. These scenes later became some of the most haunting symbols of the war's brutality. The Triple Alliance itself was also changing under the strain of prolonged conflict. Argentina reduced some of its direct military involvement over time, while Brazil assumed greater responsibility for continuing operations. Political debates emerged over how long the war should continue and what the final settlement should look like. For Brazil, however, the government believed ending the war without fully removing Lopez would leave the region unstable and risk future conflict. Brazilian commanders therefore continued pursuing the remaining Paraguayan resistance despite the terrible humanitarian consequences unfolding across the country. The Paraguayan War had now moved far beyond the political disputes that began it. The original questions of regional balance and intervention in Uruguay seemed distant compared to the reality now facing Paraguay itself. The country was fighting not for influence, but for survival amid destruction on a scale almost without precedent in South American history. Still, the conflict was not yet over. Lopez remained determined to continue resistance regardless of the cost, and the Allied armies continued hunting the remnants of Paraguayan forces through devastated landscapes. The final stage of the war would bring complete collapse, enormous tragedy, and a legacy that would shape Paraguay for generations after the fighting finally ended. As the final phase of the Paraguayan War unfolded, the conflict descended into a level of devastation that shocked even many of those who participated in it. By this stage, Paraguay had already lost enormous portions of its population, its economy had collapsed, its capital was occupied, and much of the country lay in ruins. Yet Francisco Solano Lopez still refused surrender. For him, continuing resistance had become inseparable from the survival of the nation itself, even as that resistance pushed Paraguay closer to complete destruction. After the fall of Asunción, Lopez withdrew deeper into the interior with the remaining fragments of the Paraguayan army and government. What remained of his forces no longer resembled the organized military that had launched offensives at the beginning of the war. Supplies were desperately scarce, soldiers lacked food and proper equipment, and many surviving troops were wounded, sick, or severely weakened from years of exhaustion. Despite these conditions, Lopez continued calling for resistance. He framed the struggle as a fight against foreign occupation and national annihilation. Loyalty to him remained strong among some soldiers and civilians, especially those who believed surrender would mean humiliation or revenge by the Allied powers. Others followed simply because there was no clear alternative left in a country shattered by war. The Allied forces, led increasingly by Brazil, pursued the remaining Paraguayan resistance through remote regions filled with forests, hills, and difficult terrain. The campaigns became less about large organized battles and more about relentless pursuit. Small engagements, ambushes, forced marches, and scattered fighting replaced the massive offensives of earlier years. Conditions grew even more terrible for civilians. Entire communities had already been devastated by hunger, disease, displacement, and military destruction. Agricultural production had nearly collapsed, and food shortages became catastrophic. Starvation spread through many parts of the country. Families fled repeatedly to avoid armies moving through their regions, carrying whatever possessions they could save. Women bore an enormous burden during this final stage of the war. With much of the male population dead, wounded, or serving in the army, women became responsible for sustaining what remained of Paraguayan society. They worked fields, cared for the wounded, transported supplies, and struggled to keep families alive amid conditions that grew worse month after month. Children also became deeply entangled in the conflict. As Paraguay's manpower disappeared, boys who should never have been near battlefields were pushed into military service. Some carried weapons, others transported supplies or acted as messengers, and many were drawn directly into combat. These scenes became some of the most tragic images associated with the war. One of the final major confrontations occurred at the Battle of Acostanu in 1869. Paraguayan forces included large numbers of children and adolescents desperately attempting to resist advancing Allied troops. The battle ended in disaster, with massive casualties among Paraguay's remaining defenders. Later memory of the event became a symbol of national suffering and sacrifice. Even after repeated defeats, Lopez refused to surrender. He moved constantly through the countryside with loyal followers, attempting to maintain resistance despite impossible conditions. By now, the war had become deeply personal. The survival of Lopez's leadership and the survival of Paraguay itself had become fused together in his mind. The Allied powers also faced difficult questions during this stage. Brazil especially had invested enormous resources into the war and suffered heavy casualties over years of campaigning. Many leaders believed the conflict could not truly end while Lopez remained free and capable of organizing resistance. As a result, Brazilian forces continued the pursuit with determination. The final collapse came in 1870 near Cerro Cora, in the remote northeast of Paraguay. Lopez and the last remnants of his forces were surrounded by Brazilian troops. Exhausted, isolated, and vastly outnumbered, the remaining Paraguayan resistance was destroyed. During the final confrontation, Lopez was killed after refusing surrender. His death marked the true end of the war. The conflict that had begun with regional political disputes and ambitious military plans ended with the destruction of an entire national system and the death of the man who had led Paraguay through years of catastrophic resistance. The scale of Paraguay's losses became one of the most debated and haunting aspects of the war. Exact numbers remain uncertain, but historians agree that the country suffered demographic devastation on an extraordinary scale. Large percentages of the population died through combat, disease, starvation, and displacement. The male population was especially devastated, leaving long-term social consequences that affected Paraguay for generations. Entire towns disappeared, farmland was abandoned, infrastructure collapsed, and economic systems were shattered. Recovery would take decades. Paraguay emerged from the war smaller, poorer, and traumatized by destruction unlike anything previously experienced in the region. Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay technically emerged victorious, but the war also imposed enormous costs upon them. Brazil spent huge financial resources and lost many soldiers, contributing to political and economic pressures that would later weaken the Brazilian monarchy itself. Argentina strengthened its national government in some ways through the war, but internal tensions remained. Uruguay continued struggling with political instability despite participation in the alliance. The war also transformed military and political thinking across South America. Governments recognized the enormous destructive power of modern organized warfare when combined with nationalism, industrial weapons, and mass mobilization. The conflict demonstrated how quickly political disputes could escalate into disasters that consumed entire societies. For Paraguay, memory of the war became deeply connected to national identity. Francisco Solano Lopez remained a controversial figure. Some viewed him as a reckless leader whose ambitions destroyed the country. Others remembered him as a symbol of resistance against larger foreign powers. Debates about his leadership continued long after the war ended. The Paraguayan War left scars that extended far beyond battlefields. Families were shattered, economies ruined, and generations shaped by grief and loss. The human suffering reached into nearly every part of society, making the war one of the darkest tragedies in the history of the continent. What began as a regional dispute over power and influence ended as one of the most devastating wars ever fought in the Americas. The rivers, forests, and frontier territories where armies once marched became silent witnesses to enormous destruction and sacrifice. The consequences lasted long after the final battle ended. Borders changed, governments evolved, and political systems adapted, but the memory of the war remained deeply embedded within the nations that survived it. It became a warning about ambition, escalation, and the terrible cost of conflicts that continue long after victory itself has lost meaning.